watching after. Great, there it goes. So like I was saying, when you click on that link that's in the chat, and I will send this out again in the announcement section just in case, but you're going to have your own copy. And these are questions that are going to go along with the video that I'm going to show you today. Now, if at any time, we're going to watch the video today as a class and you realize that you go back and you're like, I don't remember, I'd really like to see that video again. You have the link right here. So if you click on this, this is already hyperlinked to the video we're going to be watching. So you'll have it on this sheet right away. A couple of things to note about this worksheet for you. Some of the things are already, the question is there for you. The boxes below represent 3 domains that all organisms can be classified in: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Which of these domains consist of prokaryotes? And that's going to be answered in the video. And so if you see where it says click here and type your answer, there is a text box that's going to show up. Delete this text, meaning you're going to go ahead and delete this and write in your own answer as we go through the video, okay? And I will be pausing along the way and giving you some captions so that way we can be prepared and give you some time to answer. So what you'll notice is that wherever there is something for you to text, there is a text box that already exists. This one is going to ask for you to place a P or an E next to the words or the organisms to determine if it's a prokaryote or eukaryote. Again, you're going to learn about that in a second. So if you're listening to me go through the worksheet and you're like, Miss Fierstein, I've never heard of this word before, that's okay, right? That's the whole point of the video we're going to watch. And then if you scroll down, the same is true. This is a text box. So you're just going to click and type. And then the last page as well, those text boxes are there for you to type your answers. So that's kind of how this worksheet is going to work. And so before I start the video, are there any questions? Okay, just going to give a second to let people answer or ask their questions in the chat, just in case there are some. Okay. Great. Well, if there are no questions, then I want to go ahead and start playing the video. So again, this is only going to be about a 6-minute video. I am going to pause, so there will be some time for you guys to answer as we go through. But more specifically, I really just want you guys to be able to get some of the notes, and just giving you a heads up, there is a second video I'd like to show you that's going to kind of talk about that plasma membrane, and that again is going to be the foundation of the next week's lessons, right? So all of this is some pre-teaching. You may have heard of it before, you may never have seen it, and that's okay. That's what today's about, all right? So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and press the play button, and hopefully this works. Tell me if you can't hear the sound, okay? All right, let's see. Really quickly, can I just get a confirmation that you were able to hear the sound? Anybody just say, the sound is good? Yes, success! So excited. Okay. Oh, little moments. Okay. All right, let's go.
I'll never forget a circular red spot I developed on my arm when I was in elementary school. It left a lasting memory in my mind because it was something called ringworm. And with my active imagination, I thought I was now infected with a ring-shaped worm. I learned you gotta be careful about names because ringworm isn't caused by a worm at all. It's actually a fungus, which it turns out is pretty common and can be carried by many things like pets or soil. And since up to that point I was used to antibiotics as a way to treat infections, I assumed I'd be given antibiotics. But I wasn't. I was given an antifungal cream instead, and it went away. So it made me wonder, what made it different from the bacteria that had made me sick in the past? Why wasn't I given antibiotics? Well, antibiotics target bacteria. Antibiotics can destroy bacteria by affecting their ability to reproduce, damaging their cell walls, or interfering with their ability to make proteins that they need to survive. Just some examples. But it turns out bacterial cells and fungal cells are very different cell types. In fact, fungal cells have more in common with your cells, which are animal cells, than they have in common with bacterial cells. And that has a lot to do with the comparison of prokaryotic cells with eukaryotic cells, which is what we will focus on. First, just a refresher, recall that the modern cell theory includes a statement that all living things are made of one or more cells.
I'd like to pause here because this is something that we're going to go over in the small group. This is the cell theory. And so this is going to, if you come to small group, we're going to talk a little bit about that, but that is part of Unit 3.
All living things. In the three domains of life, prokaryotes are organisms that can be bacteria or archaea. They are unicellular, which means they are single-celled organisms. Eukaryotes are organisms that fit all in this last domain, eukarya. Eukaryotes can be protists, plants, animals, or fungi. They can be unicellular or they can be multicellular.
All right, so I'm going to pause right here.
Which means they can be made up of many cells, like you.
Okay, we're going to pause right here because this is an answer. So in number 1, it says the boxes below represent the 3 domains that all organisms can be classified in: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Which of these domains consist of prokaryotes? So why don't you go ahead and type in your answer. Which one of those are going to be part of the prokaryotes? Okay. As you guys are great, bacteria and archaea is the answer. No problem, Sam. We're just really happy you're here. Sam, if you scroll up, you're going to see a link that I put in the post or in the chat, and that is going to, well, Sean, I'm super happy you're here. Thank you. But yeah, if you scroll up, Sam, you'll see that there is a document that's going to force copy a worksheet that's going to follow along with the video. But yes, Sanjana, this is correct. Bacteria and archaea are part of the prokaryotes. And we're going to continue on with the video, but make sure you got that written down in your worksheet, all right? Great. Next section is going to be for the following organisms. Indicate where they are considered prokaryotes as a P or eukaryotes as an E. And I think we're getting to that answer here.
By the way, just to clarify, the word prokaryote is typically used to refer to the organism itself. When you are describing its cell, you are describing a prokaryotic cell. Same for eukaryote.
I'm going to go back just a second. I think that is what I was trying to get at. Oh, can you see that? So let's take a look at our document. So animal, what do we think animal is going to be under? Is animal a eukaryote or a prokaryote? And go ahead and say it with, you can write it in the chat or you can say it out loud. Is it going to be a P or is it going to be an E for animals? Good, it is an E. Great. What about bacterium, meaning multiple, more than one bacteria? What is that going to be, an E or a P? Good, it is a prokaryote. Good. Fungus or fungi. Get it? Good, it is a eukaryote. What about plants? Yes, it is also a eukaryote, so we're going to write an E. And what about protists? Good, awesome. Great job, guys. Let's keep on going. We're on the second page now. So if you go on to the second page of our worksheet, this is going to probably be, yes, based on what you know about prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells, the bacteria cell shown in the Venn diagram below is a blank cell, while the fungal cell is a blank cell. Okay, so we are going to come back to that in just a moment, making sure, let's take a look at number 4. Based on your knowledge about prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells, what are 3 structures the cells shown below would have in common? And we're about to get to that answer in a moment. So let's keep on watching.
Like you. By the way, just to clarify, the word prokaryote is typically used to refer to the organism itself. When you are describing its cell, you are describing a prokaryotic cell. Same for eukaryote. Eukaryote typically refers to the organism itself, and when you are describing its cells, those are eukaryotic cells.
Prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells do have a lot in common. Both have DNA. That's critical because DNA is the cell's genetic material. Both prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells have ribosomes, which are small organelles, an organelle being like a tiny organ. The ribosomes have the important job of making proteins.
Okay, so we've had two answers. So first of all, let's go ahead and answer number 3. So what is the bacterial cell? What would we consider a bacterial cell? Good. A bacterial cell is a prokaryote. Good. And then what would we consider a fungal cell? Great. It is a eukaryote. So great job, guys. We are starting to understand bacteria versus fungal cells, a prokaryote versus eukaryote. And then they just listed 3 structures. Let's watch that again real quick. They just talked about the 3 structures they're going to share. So let's pay attention really closely.
Prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells do have a lot in common. Both have DNA.
Okay, so they both have DNA, right? And that's really important because DNA gives the genetic information. DNA is how we pass on that information. It gives us the instructions of our cells and what to do, what to create, right? So DNA is essential for both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So that's one thing that they have in similar.
That's critical because DNA is the cell's genetic material. Both prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells have ribosomes, which are small organelles.
Ribosomes. Ribosomes also are in common with the 2 of them. You're going to learn about this a little bit later, and in our small group, we're going to talk about organelles. But ribosomes are incredibly important for the function of your cells because they are the place where they make all of the things that you need for your body. So they take those directions from the DNA and they produce it, right? So that is something that every cell needs are ribosomes. So that is also another similarity.
An organelle being like a tiny organ. The ribosomes have the important job of making proteins. Gotta make protein. Both cells have cytoplasm, the jelly fluid within cells. Both of them have a cell membrane, also known as a plasma membrane, which is critical because it controls what goes in and out of the cell.
So 2 things just was talked about. We can talk about more than 3. So we know the cell membrane is one. So cell membrane is going to be something that all of them are going to have. And then also they just talked about, goodness, I already blanked out. They just talked about how they also have cytoplasm. So cytoplasm is just the inside. Thank you, Owen. The cytoplasm is just the inside that kind of takes up that space that gives them like this jelly-filled like area where things happen. That's where the location of things happen.
The jelly fluid within cells. Both of them have a cell membrane, also known as a plasma membrane, which is critical because it controls what goes in and out of the cell, and therefore maintaining homeostasis. All cells have a cell membrane. Now, as for cell walls, most prokaryotic cells have cell walls. Many eukaryotic cells, plant cells and fungal cells, for example, can have cell walls. But there are plenty of eukaryotic cells that don't have cell walls, such as animal cells. What makes prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells different is especially interesting. Eukaryotic cells are more complex than prokaryotic cells. They tend to be larger than most prokaryotic cells. And to help me remember some more differences in this next part, I like to remember that pro in prokaryote rhymes with no, and eu in eukaryote rhymes with do.
So I'm going to pause right here. So we're talking about some differences. So if you go on to the next page on that last slide, okay, the question says in the video, a mnemonic is mentioned, right? Remember that mnemonic device is just a way to use the sounds of the words and connect it so in a way that will help you remember things, right? So a mnemonic device is mentioned. Pro in prokaryotes rhyme with no, and eu in eukaryotes rhymes with do. What we want here is to complete the following sentence stems to show some differences between the 2 cells. using this mnemonic. So meaning that the prokaryotes, we're going to be talking about what it does not have and what prokaryotes do have. So it's going to go by rather quickly. Don't worry. I have no problem going back to the video and kind of going over it again. Okay.
Prokaryotic cells have no nucleus to contain their DNA, so you will find their DNA is not contained within a nucleus. It's a bit messy here. They have no membrane-bound organelles.
So we've got two things to write down for prokaryotes have no, and what we are on the third page, Carl, yes. So what are two things so far that prokaryotes do not have? We have two things that were said. Good, there is no nucleus and there are no membrane-bound organelles. And so nucleus, remember, that's where the DNA it lives. That's where we would find the DNA. So in prokaryotes, the DNA is just kind of floating around. They're just kind of hanging out. And then they're going to go into membrane-bound organelles here in a second. But in general, prokaryotes don't have as many organelles as eukaryotes do. Let's listen a little bit more.
Membrane-bound organelles are fancy organelles that have their own membrane, like the nucleus, mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, and the Golgi apparatus. A big indicator of eukaryotic cells is this nucleus. Eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus.
Okay, so we're going to start moving into the do, but I just want to go over that term, membrane-bound organelles. So when we talk about membrane-bound organelles, like they just explained, there's a couple of organelles that have their own barrier, basically, is what they're trying to say. So they talked about the nucleus. There's a barrier or a membrane. That's what we kind of use to say like the outside of something, right? And so the nucleus has a membrane, a barrier. And so that's something that eukaryotes don't have. Same thing with mitochondria, same thing with the endoplasmic reticulum, and same thing with the Golgi bodies. And so those are three. Remember, you may not have gotten to unit 3 yet. So if you're not familiar with the organelles, do not worry. That's something that you're going to be getting to. But that is something that prokaryotes do not have. They do not have membrane-bound organelles. And so it seems like we're going to get into the eukaryotes do have. So let's take a look and see what they do. We're going to see what they do have in eukaryotic cells. So let's go ahead and play that.
To contain their DNA. Depending on what type of eukaryotic cell it is, it could have different types of membrane-bound organelles. For example, a plant cell is likely to have chloroplasts, while an animal cell would not. Wow.
And what they're talking about here is remember that chloroplast is what plants use to create or go through photosynthesis. And we don't have those because we don't go through photosynthesis, right? So that's why they're saying we don't have some things that plant cells do. However, plant cells have a nucleus like we do. So we are considered both eukaryotic cells.
Look at all this alphabetized vocabulary. If you want to try to practice your skills, pause the video and see how many of these vocabulary words you can use to compare and contrast prokaryotic cells with eukaryotic cells.
So would we be green if we did have them? Actually, kind of. So in chloroplast is the location where photosynthesis happens, but it's actually chlorophyll that is what makes the plants green, and the chlorophyll is what absorbs the sunlight. And so why we see plants being green, and this has to do with physics, and you're getting me off topic, but I love science, so here we are. But they are going to be, chlorophyll is what absorbs all of the sunlight. And the only wavelength they don't absorb is green light, and they reflect it back. And so that's why we see green. It's not because the sunlight makes the plant green. It's because chlorophyll is absorbing all of the other wavelengths, red light, yellow light, blue light, everything else except for green, and it gets pushed, and that's what's reflected, and that's why we see green. So to answer your question, yes, if you had chloroplasts, really it's the chlorophyll that would make us green. And then Sean, to answer your question, if you have the worksheet that was introduced, you have the access to the video. It's in the title. So if you go to the first slide in the worksheet, then you have the link to this video right here. But what I would like for us to do real quick is I want you guys to do your best, and I'm going to put you guys in groups real quick. And in your groups, I would love for you guys to try to use as much vocabulary words as you can and describe what you've learned so far, specifically answering the question, what is the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes? Okay, so let's try that for just a couple of minutes. I'm going to put you groups of 2 to 3, just so that way it's a little bit more comfortable for, all of as many students as we have. So let me go ahead and add a room. Let's see. There are... How do I redo? You know what? Never mind. I didn't know how to do it. And now I get... No, it's not on purpose. I couldn't figure it out. So we're going to move on because I got nervous. So we're just going to keep going with the video. Okay.
It's important to grasp that all cells of living things fall in one of these two categories. And understanding the characteristics of these two cell types can help us better understand the diversity of living things, whether they are archaea, bacteria, protists, fungi, plants, or animals. And in the case of my example, realizing whether an infection you're dealing with involves prokaryotic cells, such as bacteria, or eukaryotic cells, such as the fungus. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
All right. So hopefully we have a better understanding of the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And that's really going to be helpful for understanding the foundation as you move into Unit 3. And so as you move into Unit 3, they're going to start breaking it down into those two categories and then move forward with the different actions and different parts. So again, small groups, we're going to go over organelles in our small groups and kind of talk about what each organelle's role or job is within the cell. But we've got about 15 minutes left. So really quickly, I first want to take a pause. Are there any questions? And Owen, you should be getting to Unit 3 either today or tomorrow at some point this week. So that's why I'm doing a little pre-teaching. But are there any questions that I can answer right off the bat and clarify before I go into showing you the next video? We've got about 15 minutes. And the next video I want to share with you is more about the plasma because that I think is going to be a little confusing, and I would like to show you a video so it makes a little bit more sense before you get to the reading. So are there questions about, so homeostasis, good. Yes, so homeostasis is different than heredity. Homeostasis is that your body is always wanting to be in balance. So when we are, and that's when we have these reactions. So like if we are really cold, our body is going to start shivering and our teeth are going to start chattering because your body is trying to heat itself up to stay in homeostasis. It wants to be in that good balanced range. Same thing if you're really hot and you begin to sweat. It's trying to release the water and trying to release some sort of liquid so that it evaporates, and that evaporation process cools down the body. So homeostasis is when your body and your cells are trying to be in balance, right? And they mentioned it in the video because things leaving and going into the cell is part of keeping that balance. So that's homeostasis. Heredity has to do with our genes. It's what we pass on to the next generation. So, if you ask, you may hear something about your heredity. It may talk about your past genes, your history, your genetic history with your family, and those are the two differences. Good question. Are there any other questions about prokaryotes versus eukaryotes and what makes the difference, right? knowing that prokaryotes are missing a lot of organelles. They're very simple in structure, and that is what we usually think of when we talk about bacteria, and the way we're going to approach bacteria is very different than how we would approach, like they said, fungus, right? And part of that is that our fungus cell, the fungal cells are so much closer like our cells that we need to treat it differently, and focus on the differences, and we need a cream and stuff like that. Fungus is a lot more difficult to take care of than a bacterial infection. How we doing with that? Gonna give another minute or two for anyone to ask some questions. It's not irrelevant. It's a great question, Emmett. So this is really an opportunity for you to keep it as your notes. This is a great place to study from for when you get to your test. So this is just an opportunity for you to take down some information that you can use later when you are getting ready for assessments. Okay, so the next video I want to show for you, I don't have a worksheet for you. Today is for the test today, or unit 3. So this is not for the test today. Again, we're doing some pre-teaching. Last week I covered over a broad range of topics that's going to be in unit 2. So this is going to be looking ahead. So that's what I'm probably going to be doing unless I see any other reason, unless people are asking specifically for me to, you know, do it differently. So this is just a little bit to help you understand the reading, because these are kind of concepts that I have experience with myself are more difficult, or I've taught biology in the past, and this is where it got sticky for people. So I'm kind of trying to get ahead of that. So when you get to the reading, you'll already have seen this, and maybe it will make more sense. So this next video is it is 3 minutes and 35 seconds long. So it's not going to be super long, but I don't have a worksheet for this. So what I'm going to have you do instead is I'm going to have you guys go ahead and take out a piece of paper, write some stuff down. I'm going to pause as we go, and I'm going to tell you the things that I think are important. Of course, you are welcome to add in more information. I encourage you. That's practicing listening notes, right? Lecture notes. So I'm going to pause things that I want you to write down, but then as we keep going, if you hear some details that are going to be helpful, you should be writing that down too, okay? And this is going to take us to the last 10 minutes or so. So make sure you have something to write down with, a piece of paper, pencil, ready to go.
Welcome to Construction of the Cell Membrane. In this video, you'll learn the makeup and the basics of cell membrane function by examining the molecular structure of the cell membrane. It's a critical step to learning about the fundamental unit of life, the cell.
Okay, so I'm seeing that there's an echo. How do I mute then? Uh-oh, I don't know how to do that. Mute myself? Okay.
The membrane's main job is to protect the cell from its surroundings. It separates the cell's interior from the outside environment and helps it keep its shape. The membrane is selectively permeable, which means it allows certain organic molecules to pass into and out of the interior.
Okay, thank you guys for the feedback. Glad to have fixed it. So I just want to pause really quickly because as we were trying to figure all that stuff out, there was some information. So a couple things that I want you guys to take about this membrane. The semi-permeable is one of the words. So I'm going to type it in the chat. So this word semi-permeable means that it allows some things to go in and out. And one of the functions that the plasma membrane, so remember the membrane is that barrier that keeps, the cell inside, right? And then to the outside environment. So when it means semi-permeable, it allows some things to enter and some things to leave. And that's really important because we talk about this word homeostasis, and that is really, so I will get to that, Emmett. But what it means is it's going to allow for our body to get to homeostasis, which is that balance. And our cells want to be, in the inside of our cells, want to be balanced with the outside of the cell. And so that's why we have the semi-permeable. So some things are going to be allowed to be let in and out. Things like water, things like oxygen are going to be allowed in and out without any issue. And then there's going to be other things where it's going to need to check, like, all right, what are you? What are you doing here? How are you going to benefit my cell? And so that's kind of where that semi-permeable kind of comes in. So we're going to hear a little bit more about that in a second.
It allows certain organic molecules to pass into and out of the interior. The cell membrane is mainly composed of lipids and proteins. Its framework consists of a double layer of phospholipids. Lipids
I'm muted. Great, thank you. So one thing that it said is that it is made of phospholipids. Now, in Unit 2, we talked about different, 4 main structures. We talked about carbohydrates, we talked about nucleic acids, we talked about lipids, and we talked about, I'm forgetting the last one. Nucleic acids, carbohydrates, lipids is one of them, and and amino acids. Amino acids part of nucleic. Yes, no, amino acids, correct. Thank you. Thank you. So this is where one of those structures come into play. So phospholipid, right? So that what they're telling you is that this membrane is made up of, and they're going to break it down for you in a second, but I just wanted to do a little talking about it first. It's going to use that fatty chain, right? We talked about how lipids are really just fats, and that sometimes we associate fat as being bad, but that's usually when we're talking about excess fat. This is such a good example of why lipids are important for our bodies, because we use it to protect our cells. And it's going to go into the breakdown of why we call it phospholipid. And so let's keep an ear out for that.
make up 50% of most membranes, although depending on the location, they may make up to 80%. The remainder is made from proteins. Lipids make the membrane flexible, and the proteins help transfer molecules across the membrane. There are 2 major types of proteins: tightly coiled, rod-shaped fibrous proteins, which help give the cell support and shape, and the more compact, globular-shaped integral proteins and peripheral proteins. These help cells communicate and transport molecules. Examples include glycoprotein, pore protein, and channel protein.
So what they're doing right now, you don't necessarily need to write down all of the specific proteins. I think they'll talk about that in your notes, like when you get to the lesson. But I want to just point out, we talked about how the membrane is made up of phospholipids, right? Which they're going to talk about more in a second, and proteins. And each one of the things they just talked about is a specific protein, and they each play a function. So some of them are structural, some of them are to communicate in and out of the cell, and some of them are going to be ones that allow things to come and pass. So it's not so important to know all of the specific ones right now. You'll get to that later, but just know that that's part of the membrane that they're talking about.
Because the cell membrane is mostly lipid, it only allows lipid-soluble substances like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and steroids to pass through. Water-soluble substances, such as glucose, amino acids, ions, and water, need the help of the various proteins in order to move across the membrane. 2 layers of
So again, you don't need to know all of those specifics, but I just want to talk about this word soluble. Soluble just means it can be dissolved in water. So oxygen and some of the other carbon dioxide, and I forget the third one that they mentioned, they are not things that break down in water. So that's why they were talking about non-soluble.
of phospholipid molecules
Steroids, thank you, Emma.
self-assemble so that their water-soluble or hydrophilic heads form the surface and interior of the membrane, and the water-insoluble or hydrophobic tails face each other. The fibrous proteins.
So let's go over that really quickly. They just use the word hydrophobic and hydrophilic. And so we should recognize this word phobic, right? Phobic is often related to a phobia, right? Something that we are adverse to, something that we have some sort of issue. Like, for example, I have a phobia about belly buttons, right? I am repulsed by them, can't see them, don't want to think about them, nothing. And so we can use this idea of a phobia to understand hydrophobic tails. Hydrophobic means, if we break down that word, phobic meaning repels against, and hydro meaning water, then we can understand that these lipid tails, right, are hydrophobic, meaning they don't like water. Okay, they don't like water. Now the hydrophilic heads, which they talked about, hydrophilic does mean they like water. And so it's going to explain how that plays a role, maybe not in this specific example, but in your notes, at least they'll be showing you that.
Water insoluble or hydrophobic tails face each other. The fibrous proteins may span the entire membrane and serve as receptors for the cell. They communicate with the external environment using hormones and neurotransmitters. One type of globular protein forms pores to allow lipid-insoluble water molecules to pass through. Other integral proteins serve as channels and selectively support ions, including nutrients such as sugars or amino acids. Channel proteins are usually quite specific, so each one specializes in transporting a single substance or group of similar chemical substances. Globular proteins are peripheral, meaning they're associated with the surface of the cell. These include enzymes or glycoproteins.
So what they were saying over here is they're breaking it down, each protein that's in the layer. So we have these channel proteins, and what they're saying is that this is allowing some substances to pass through and others not to. They're very specific. So you can see that there were a couple of like dots that came through, and then you can also see that there were some others that didn't. So they're very specific, right? And that's what makes it semi-permeable, because only some things can pass through.
In transporting a single substance or group of similar chemical substances. Globular proteins are peripheral, meaning they're associated with the surface of the cell. These include enzymes or glycoproteins. These proteins have carbohydrate associations that identify the cell. Cholesterol molecules are embedded in animal cell membranes, but not in plant cell membranes. They're found dispersed through the cell membrane and help strengthen the membrane wall. In addition, they, along with phospholipids, help make the membrane impermeable to water-soluble substances.
Impermeable means that they can't get through. So the cholesterol is helping keep the structure and keeping it so that things can't get into the cell that shouldn't be.
Cell membranes are integral to cell health. With their combination of lipids, proteins, and cholesterol, they are able to complete a complex variety of tasks essential to life. Cell membranes keep the outside out and the inside in.
Okay, so that was a lot of vocabulary words, but what I really wanted us to focus on was the visualization, right? So understanding that as you read into it, so you're going to get to a reading this week about the cell membrane. And the cell membrane is important to understand because it's going to talk about how things get in and out of the cell, going back to that homeostasis. So knowing and understanding the different aspects of the membrane is going to be helpful. So like I said, I really just wanted you to get a visual. So we've got this phospholipid, right? So we've got this, water-loving head with this water-hating tail, and they kind of go hand in hand. And that's because they having the tails facing each other keeps water out of this and keeps things out of that membrane that creates that barrier. So then we've got these different protein structures that does different things. So this guy helps communicate. They talked about neurotransmitter and hormones, knowing that our hormones is how our body communicates. That's what we're talking about. Whenever you hear about hormones, that's what it is. It is allowing our bodies to communicate with each other through a chemical response. And so this is one of those ways that it communicates with the cells. This is a channel protein, as they said. The channel protein is what lets some things in and others out. They talked about the globular protein, and that's really helping the structure of the membrane and keeping it permeable, meaning that you can't get, or impermeable, excuse me, that other things can't get in that aren't supposed to. And then they have cholesterol, and cholesterol kind of keeps that structure and keeps things out of that in there. Question that you could talk about for hours, but I'll ask, so the proteins and such that filter the molecules are not by themselves living. So how do they go about filtering? Does it just have to do with the shape? And the answer, Colin, is yes, it does have to do with the shape. So that is 100% correct. So when we talk about, in the first chapter, we talked about the importance of structure and function, and this is a great way. So Colin, thank you so much for asking, because this is a great example of how structure completely relates to its function. So, you know, when we talked about this channel protein, that only some things can go in, that means that the channel protein is going to have a structure that only matches other molecules and other things that it's going to let in, right? And so that's one thing about how it's going to filter. There's these connectors, and they talked about these receptors, and that's another way it's going to fit perfectly like a puzzle piece, right? So that's why it's really important that we, that structure and protein, and when we talk about DNA, we're going to get to that later, but this is why it's so important that DNA is not altered, because that's what's it's going to give the directions to make the shape of these proteins. And then the shape of those proteins is 100% related to the function. So Colin, that was a great question. Yes, I could talk about it for hours, but I will stop myself there. Are there any other questions that I can answer before we go? This is the last thing that I have for you. Again, you know, you have the video for the amoeba sisters, what we talked about, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. I can go ahead and post this link into the announcement if you want to watch it again. Again, this video had a lot of vocabulary words, things like soluble, that you may not be familiar with. And I don't want you to get too stressed about the vocabulary words. I really want you guys to focus on the imagery. I want you to get that mental picture so that when you go to read it, you have something that you can imagine and something that you can base it off of. And then there are tons of YouTube videos that talk about the membrane, some that are more detailed, some that are less, but that is up to you if you want to Google that. I just wanted to show you one option. Are there any questions? Well, if there are no more questions, that's what I have for you today. I do have a small group coming up at 11 o'clock, so I'm going to get ready for that. But if you guys don't have any questions, that's what I've got. So thank you so much. Thank you all for joining me this morning. I'll see you in small group, and if I don't see you in small group, then I will see you next week. Thanks, guys. Remember to communicate, come to those help sessions. I'm there for you. I am here for you. So please do not hesitate.